I took my little example Fit for Life app from last week and I added a model to it. And when I created this project, it does have authentication in it. And so when I run it, there actually is a database in this already. Although I have not run the update database command, but the register and login system creates its own little database. And so until I do update database, I can't, if I click on those, I'll end up getting an error. But like right now, I can look at everything because I have no database connected with this whatsoever. So I'm going to create a model for this. And then when I get to the point where I'm going to do migrations, I will update the database for my model. And I'm also going to update the database for the login system. So I'm going to do both at the same time. So the first step for code first is to create your model. And I did that. I'm calling it members. And you can see I've got ID. This is going to be my primary key. That is a convention in code first. It's going to take the ID. It automatically would make it an identity column, which is going to increase by 1. So when I run this, I won't have to put in an ID number. And that would automatically be required. I also decided to require the first name and the last name, but I am allowing them to be nullable. And that part of the reasoning for that is I was getting an error, not really an error, just a warning that when it comes out of the constructor that those may be null values. So basically I'm allowing those to be nullable because of that. However, when I do generate the forms and everything, they will be required. Everything else is nullable and I am not making it required. So the things that I want, to be filled in are the ones that I am making required. Okay, so you can kind of see how I've set this up. I did set up an enum that gives them choices. And so this is how you set up the property for that. And once I completed this, of course, you always run a build because you want to make sure you don't have any errors. Errors are easiest to find if you look for them in small little steps. So I run a build after absolutely everything. My next step was to verify that I had Entity Framework. Now, because I am using the registration system, it did create a data folder and it has a context file. And this is specifically for that registration system. And in order for it to do that, it would have had to have installed Entity Framework. But it's always a good idea to make sure that it is the correct version because you could update it. So if I go into NuGet packages and I look at what's installed, I can see that Core Server is there and it is the correct version. I am using .NET 6 and this matches. And I can see Core Tools are there. And again, that is the correct version. So I am not going to update. I'm just going to leave that alone. Okay. My next step is to create the context file and to add some seed data. And so my context file, I put in models and I called it fitness context. And so you can see that I'm deriving from DB context. And this is where the table will be created. It's going to be using my members class to create a membership table. And then this is the segment where I'm going to add my seed data. And so it, again, is connecting with that members class, and it's saying that I have data. And when you do the seed data, even though you have the ID as an identity column, you do have to provide values when you are seeding it. And the other pieces of data that I have are the ones that are required. And the first one I went ahead and filled in email, even though that's not required. Okay, so I've got first name and last name required, so I filled those in. And then anything else you want to fill in is kind of optional. Okay, so that is my context file. And it is going to be using that to create the table and then put data in the table. The next thing I need to do is modify my app settings.json file. Now, your app settings file is going to have a default connection in here. And it's got that in here because of the registration and authentication. So you really can only have one connection string in here. So you're going to have to live with default connection, okay? And what I did was I just changed the name of the database because it gives it a really long, kind of weird name. And so I just named the database what I want to call it, okay? That's the only change I made in here. And then in program CS, this is where you have to add your dependency injection. And so it's going to be passing the resources that the controller needs. And this is where we connect our code, our context file, to the database itself. So here we've got a connection string, and we've got that set to the default connection. And the default connection was defined over in app settings. And that is our database. Okay, so connection string basically represents our database. And for application DB context, you will see that we've already got the dependency injection that has been added. And then you can also see that we've got some dependency injection here for the user identity system. And that's all part of login and authentication. So what we need to do is add dependency injection for our new context file. And so we give it the name of the context file, and then we are passing it that connection string. So basically that connection string, okay, default connection, is going to be associated now with the fitness context and the application DB context. Okay, so both of those, and if you look at the files, okay, you can kind of see what they look like, but both of those are now going to be associated with default connection. Default connection is associated with the database that is going to be created. All these things are kind of tightly interwoven. So it's kind of helpful to see how all the connections kind of line up. So at this point, what we're going to do is go ahead and run the migrations. Now, we're going to do that in the package manager console. And before I do that, I am going to run a build. Okay, and then my package manager console is down here. Okay, if you don't see it, you can add it from the menus. And so the first thing I'm going to do is add migration for my fitness context. So I'm just going to say add migration minus context fitness context. Right? And when you have multiple context files, you have to tell it which one you're doing migrations for. And let me see, I do want to give this a name. So I'm just going to call this initial create. Okay, so I have named that, and you will notice that I now have a migration folder. And here's what I've named it. And so if you look at this, you can see here's a create table command. You can see all of these are going to end up being columns or fields in my database. Okay, you can kind of see the SQL code there that is going to be used to create each of the columns. You can see that the ID is my key. And then you can also see the insert data commands where it's going to add the data to the table. Okay, so that's the up method. So when I run migration, that is what's going to run. Then if I decided to back out of the migration, it would run through the drop, and you can see that it actually gets rid of the table. Okay, and so I'm going to go ahead and do the update database. And let's see, minus context, fitness context. Okay, and because I'm choosing fitness context, it's going to be running through this code. Okay, then I also need to update the database with application DB context. And if you wanted to look, here's the code for the identity schema. So we've got a table that's going to be called ASP net roles, ASP net users, ASP net role claims. And you can kind of see this has got a primary key, foreign key relationship. So lots of tables that are going to be created for this. Okay, and so I'm going to go ahead and do update database minus context. And this is application DB context. Okay, so now I actually have a database with the tables for the authentication and my new members table. So how do I see that? You've got to go into the SQL Server Object Explorer. And you can see I do this a lot, but you can always use your view menu to access anything that you happen to be missing. So there's different local DBs for code first and database first. And so it does usually take me a while to figure out which one MVC is using, but I can see already, you see all of these tables. That looks like the one that MVC is using. Yep, and here is my database. There's my tables. And so all of those ones that were created through the authentication and login, you can see all of those tables, and you get to see my membership table. Okay, and so this should remind you guys a little of SQL Server. Okay, so we can take a look at that. And then if you right click, you can view the data. And that just tells you if your seed data worked. Okay, so I'm going to go back over to Solution Explorer. And at this point, I am ready to do some scaffolding. So what I want is a controller and views for my members. So I'm going to right click on controller, go to add, and I'm going to choose new scaffolded item. MVC. I want MVC controller with views using entity framework. That is what I want to add. And my model class. So this is going to be, my class is called members. DB context, fitness context. And I'm going to keep all those on. Controller name. So there's some people do not like the pluralization of the controller name. So they would prefer member controller. I do not care if you guys have the S in there or not. You'll notice that home is not plural. So if you want to be consistent, you can call it, get rid of the S. I'm going to go ahead and add. And I'll pause while it's doing this because this might take a few minutes. Alrighty, so it has generated the member controller, and it has a member directory and member views. So what it doesn't have is the member index is not in the main menu. So I'm going to be adding that. But if you take a look at your member controller, you will notice that you have an index action method. And here it's got fitness context. And then that is going to contain database information. And so here it is, let's see. It's looking to see if there is anything in the database table. And so as long as it's not null, it's going to take whatever's there and throw it into a list. This lets you retrieve individual items from the list. You can see that this is nullable, so it doesn't have to have an ID, but if you do have an ID, then it will return a specific record or row. Okay, so you can kind of look through this. This is link code, the same link code that we learned back in 195. So this should be looking familiar to you. And what I'm going to do just to make this, well, I can run it as it is. Okay, so obviously this is still going to work. But what I want is to go to member and index. And usually the first time you try to bring it up, it does take a few minutes. But here it is. And because this is being pulled into layout, it's going to pick up all of my formatting. So I don't really like how this looks, so I would do some customizing here. I think the edit looks okay. I probably changed the title. So what you're going to want to do is just do a little customizing for your CRUD screens. And that would be styling with Bootstrap. Because out of the box, I mean, it works, but it really does not look very attractive. And the titles could be a little bit better. Okay, but everything should at this point work. And you're also going to want to go into layout. And you're going to want to add the members. So I think I'll probably just call it member list. And so I'm just going to copy this one. And let's see, it's the index, but the controller is the member controller. And what I want to display on the menu is member list. All right, let me save. And now if I run it, that should show up. And I should be able to click it and get to the index. So obviously the name index is horrible. That should be member list. You don't actually have to display everything on the summary page. And as you can see, it's pulling in the property names uh, as is. And so I can show you how to fix that. Let me pause a second. All right, so in your model, you can add a display property, and then in parentheses, its name equals, and then whatever text you want to display. And the views will all pick this up. Okay, so you can see that for the ones that I didn't like first name all squished and last name, gender identity, and cell phone, I've changed that. So now if I run this and I go to member list, it picks up my nice names. And if I go into details, it picks them up here as well. Okay, so the only other things I need to fix are really little cosmetic things in each of the CRUD pages.